Hi, I'm Patty Seybold, and I'm here today with Doug Engelbart. Doug Engelbart has been working for over 40 years in designing and implementing systems and methodologies to help people and organizations thrive in a world characterized by increasing complexity and urgency. Doug's objective throughout his career, and the objective we're going to be talking about today, is to pursue the design of high-performance organizations. Organizations equipped to maneuver through increasing complexity and with greater speed, agility, precision, and vision.
What I'd really like to know is, what is your interest in this? What does it do in your world for you?
Well, to me, the vision is very exciting. Your vision is very exciting, and the idea of creating a collaborative vision and getting other people to join us in making it real excites me a lot, because I see the inevitability of a knowledge-based economy, of companies working in a collaborative environment, and I see the crying need for us as a computer industry to have the kind of interoperability that you're describing. I want to get us to the point where we can build on the work and the thinking that you and your group have done for 40 years and bootstrap ourselves on top of that and not reinvent the wheel. So from a technical standpoint, it excites me a great deal. In terms of organizational improvement and organizational effectiveness and organizational learning, I'm very excited as well, because I think your bootstrapping concept and the idea of forming a sea community of people who throughout the world who can work together to begin to really collaboratively build these learning, self-improving, organically improving organizations is a very exciting idea, and the world really needs to move ahead. Doug, I'd like to start by asking you to tell me a brief history of your career.
All right. There are perhaps 5 major phases. From 51 to 56 or 7, getting a PhD at Berkeley and teaching a little bit and trying to learn enough about computers to project what I could do. Then from 57 for the next 20 years to 77, it was at Stanford Research Institute. The first 4 or 5 years were working on standard kind of special computer components. Then I began to get time in 1959 to start studying what I wanted to. And between there and 1962 developed a conceptual framework, the whole structure about how I thought people could augment their capabilities. And in the midst of that evolved a strategy I call the bootstrapping strategy. Then we began to get money from the Defense Department by 63 that lasted for 13 or 14 years. I'm very, very lucky to have that. And we continue to build a system along those principles that grew and grew in comprehensive capability. And by 1973 or 4, we could actually start supporting working organizations out through the ARPA network. And in the meantime, we had become the Network Information Center for the ARPA network, so we got a lot of network experience and actually started serving the community through that. Then in 1977, SRI decided that we'd sort of outlived the research part of all of this, so they sold off the commercial rights to what we had done. And so about half of the group and I went to a commercial world to timeshare. And so for the next 6 years, we tried to learn how to survive actually selling things commercially. And then McDonnell Douglas bought Timeshare and TimeNet in 1984. And I very soon managed to start interacting with the aerospace side, which was an extremely good experience, because and then we found out that a lot of the principles of architecture and the system we'd built had a great deal of potential applicability in that heavy industrial environment, which was what I had hoped. But we couldn't quite swing getting things really moving because they were so strange. But by 3 years ago, it was clear that the world's going to need this, and it was bigger than one organization. So my daughter Christina and I set up this Bootstrap Institute and got some funding from Apple and Sun and Mitch Kapor, and set up for several years at Stanford. And we gave seminars that had industrial people come to, and really evolved a lot more. And now full-time it's trying to get other organizations to join with us. You know, it's like together we could really make it happen. And that's what I'd like to, in this discussion today, try to clarify all that.
Here's the outline for today's discussion. Let's give an example of what high-performance organizations would be like. You have a vision of what's possible with this combination of systems and tools and architecture and open systems that you've been working with and evolving over 40 years. Let's put ourselves in a position where that infrastructure and open systems technology already exists in the world today. Let's make that assumption, and let's just talk about what it would be like to work in an organization. You mentioned, for example, that you spent some time working in aerospace. So let's just imagine that this is an aerospace company, and maybe you're the top executive of this aerospace company.
Right.
What are your systems like? What can you do? How do you operate?
One thing, a very large program like an aerospace program is a great many projects, and they've evolved a management method where they break down the whole work into sort of a hierarchy of ever finer jobs and who's assigned and the budgeting to that and the control and all of that. And they get down to places where they actually have to start keeping track of the manufacturing processes and the suppliers that can support it and all. Well, it turned out that the system that I hope we can describe more in detail like that just was beautiful for representing that and for letting people just jump into the middle, move around, follow reference links off to things, and just anybody involved that had a right to access that could see that common model, and it would be dynamically changing and just always keep track of it. It's very, very handy.
Now, if I'm an executive in a business today, I might be running Coca-Cola, or I might be running Federal Express, or any kind of a company. And the vision that you have for this kind of infrastructure already existed in the real world. What would my systems look like? What would I be able to do in that environment that I can't do today?
Well, a great deal more ability for your organization as a whole to perceive what the world's like and ingest what's happening out there and integrate it into operational value. And just the dynamics of all of the knowledge work, which is the emphasis that it came up. We'll talk about that. But for instance, the interaction with customers, that a customer, they want to have the interaction, and that has value to different parts of the functional organization. So here, that just a document gets implanted in there, and almost anybody that wants to or needs to can have a citation linkage, boom, they could just find that or get to it right away. And you could track what's happening to that thing through a prescribed path of who's responsible to do something about what that customer wanted or needed or suggested, etc. Just beautifully throughout the whole organization, if you wish to.
So I could be sitting at my desk and I could have available to me all the records about my customers, including who last talked to someone, what's the status of the projects that we're working on together. I could, as you said, pursue a path. I could follow a line, a trail of thought. If I get an inquiry from a customer that says, gee, it looks like we're falling behind on this joint venture project we're working on, I would be able to go find what was going wrong with that project.
Right, and many ways to find it. There are all kinds of retrieval ways, but the thing is that the documents and the records are there to go, you can move and look. And it's a different paradigm from saying, there's a database and I want to send a query out and have it bring back to me some report. It's just a very turned around sort of way of looking and thinking about this kind of knowledge rather than just numerical statistics that you may want to go and survey and bring back.
That's a very good point, because you're saying it's not just a database that sits there statically and I go and do a query.
That's right. Very, very
Instead,
different.
it's a living, organic, networked environment that people are constantly contributing to,
Right.
that I can view in any way I want to and navigate in any way I want to. And I can do this across networks,
Right.
and I can do it across different computer systems,
Right.
and across different applications.
Right.
That's what you're really talking about.
And you say, oh, how could I learn to fly all that so much? They said, well, part of the new architectures are going to be such that it's very easy for somebody who's skilled, that you can flip and be talking to somebody as though in an intercom, and they do a little bit, and suddenly your screen has got what they have on it, and they can take you through and show you what it is, or hand you off to other people. So there are many things about the technology that will be very, very, very different. And one analogy I've made through the years is I've had this image of organizations that really are superlatively more effective. And it's very hard to communicate. So one model or analogy I'd make is, say, consider an organic organism that's growing, and a biological one. And suppose that in a very, very short period of time, evolutionary-wise, a brand new nervous system comes out that is much faster, has much more central capacity, much better sensors and all of that. And you think, is that organism just going to sort of harness that, and good, I can wiggle a little faster or see a little farther? No, you say the whole organism is going to start evolving to harness all that better. And that's the way organizations are going to do. And it's a very different sort of perception from if you think of just automating today's methods and structures and using today's knowledge in a little bit of supportive way. So that's the image I've had through the years, and it's really caused a real schism sort of between what I propose and talk about and how I describe it from what the others are. So the big problem that exists is trying to sort of get a shared image of how much potential there will be, and people's approach to going after that future would be affected tremendously by how big their image is of what's there to go after.
And one of the analogies you're making, this organic organism having a new nervous system, you're saying that as organizations get the new nervous system that is possible now with, or will be possible with, an open hyperdocument system, which we'll be talking about, a networked environment, the right navigational tools, that they too will want to evolve, or will begin to evolve naturally into much more effective high-performance organizations. And there will be just an order of magnitude difference between an organization that has this new nervous system and evolutionary capability and the organization that doesn't take advantage of it.
Yeah, it's between the one that's learned how to harness it.
Okay.
Okay, and lots of changes throughout the whole organism, you expect. Right. So then the framework about what all's involved is part of what evolved in 1961 and 2, as well as the strategy is saying that there's a lot of change going to come about. How do we sort of effectively go at it strategically so we don't fall apart, so we sort of climb the hill in the most orderly, direct way?
As we've said, our objective today is going to be to talk about pursuing high-performance organizations, and we're going to do that by going through a series of hypotheses.
Correct.
And the first one we want to talk about is the Kodiak, the collaborative knowledge work environment. So first, what I'd like you to do is to just define Kodiak for me.
Right. I have a slight antipathy towards acronyms, but there just wasn't any way to give something a name that wasn't already sort of grouped together. So it's the way to start pursuing this strategically was to look for a particular type, a set of knowledge work capabilities that if you went after those to augment those early would help facilitate the rest in the bootstrapping sense. So the Kodiak sort of describes that set of capabilities, and the acronym stands for Concurrent Development, Integration, and Application of Knowledge. So that concurrency of doing all three of those things. You're developing it, you're integrating, you're applying it. See? And there's more concurrency to show here too. It's in this diagram where we just jump immediately to say, well, look at the functional activities going on in a typical manufacturing organization. And you realize that in almost every one of these, you've got that same kind of process that has to go on inside there. And yet, they're all going on concurrently. It doesn't that marketing does it and then it stops while somebody else does something and then it stops. There's all that concurrently. So the more and more as things happen in different rates, these things have to be concurrently adapting to each other and exchanging and integrating their own information and applying it as it goes. So that's a first picture, and we have some more diagrams that we can show.
Okay.
So this is one where we would just jump immediately into what you'd say is a complex project, just to show the sort of real meaty kind of Kodiak process. And you say, well, it's developing information, and we coined a term, it's sort of the electronic handbook of the future is what represents the current state of the product you're trying to develop, or the knowledge product. And it's got all that visibility that you can move around it very much. And so as you're building that, which sort of tells you at any given time what the status is, what we can expect in the future, what we know now, what our plans, our budget, actual designs, and all of that. That's the evolving product. And we're also ingesting information that's relevant to our project from the outside world, and we want to have that starting to be integrated in the same media with the same flexible way to move around inside it. And the way this stuff gets evolved is this gets digested by a lot of dialogue and notes and comments, and so does all of the notes and comments about what's out here and what needs changing and all of that. So there's a lot of dialogue that if you record that in the same way, and so have all three of these things in this consistent new multimedia hyperdocument way, that and learn to move around there very flexibly, that Kodiak process is ingesting, integrating information, developing a lot of new one, and applying it all the time.
So these are all things that we do today in our organizations.
Correct.
The difference in what you're proposing is that we do it all online, and we do it all very explicitly, and we do it in a structured way, taking advantage of an architecture that would allow us to really leverage the information that we're collecting anyway.
That's right. That goes on all the time in any place, and yet you realize now there's very little record left and very little explicitly done here. Some people might collect information, but who has access to it from the outside world? You have an advanced or technology exploration group, but they might publish a report and circulate it once in a while. But all the sort of things like who I met at the last conference and what they said and such as that. So that should just come in and get integrated and be available very much quicker.
Great.
Yes.
Now let's talk about how that works within a particular unit in an organization. Let's take the marketing department, for example, or the engineering department, or any single unit within an organization.
Right. It's here's some functions going on inside all the time, and with the external world, you're scanning for information and knowledge about it that you're bringing into your intelligence collection, and you're ingesting things that might be sent your way, etc. So it's a very some of it is happening all the time, and some you could organize to be a lot more explicit about. And every organizational unit needs that, even down to the limiting one is an individual. You've got to start doing that. And then the recorded dialogue and the knowledge products is circulating around, but these are the ways you interact with the outside world, bringing stuff in, and you're doing the analyzing, digesting, integrating, and developing it. So the impact of this is, or the prevalence of it is just universal. And the next thing you want to show is how lots of these functional units, organizational units, when they're banding together, what happens. So I think the next slide is a sort of way to show that, is say, here you may have all these functional units that are part of a larger organizational unit, and down here is a component organizational unit, and it's got that same thing going on relative to it. And you think about how much of this intelligence collection might be shared significantly with the others, so you have to have this concurrent sort of coordination between that, and invaluable. How much of the dialogue that's going on about things is with external people along these pathways here. It's all very important. And your knowledge product is something that's going to be used within that framework all the time. So the concurrency of this thing doing its work concurrently with all the others doing it, and concurrently with the whole making its collection, is a really vital linkage with that term concurrent. And and you just know that the future organization is going to just have all that really dynamic, really fast, new knowledge comes in here, and very, very rapidly be available to the rest of them.
And I don't see any way you can survive in today's world without having that capability. I'm surprised we've gotten this far in business without having the kind of capability that you're talking about.
Yes, it's a good question. Makes me wonder how far this far is.
Yes, right, true. Now, this picture tells me how all of this ingestion and assimilation and sharing and output of information taking place at each of these nodes and across nodes concurrently. But this is just within a single organization. Now, the fact of the matter is all of our organizations are working collaboratively together and working on various joint ventures. We have customer-supplier relationships. So, in fact, what you're proposing goes beyond a single organization, needs to be implementable across organizations. A key challenge is online interactive interoperability among Kodiak domains. I thought a good way to talk about that might be to go through kind of a case study approach. So let's take a look at what happens in the aerospace industry, for example, which you're familiar with, when you have two organizations needing to work in this complex way.
Well, it turned out that the Air Force is saying, when we give out a big program to somebody, we want partnership among major aerospace companies to do our, so that's become the way they're forcing it to do. And it really brings out this business that within each one of these, you've got all of this stuff going on. And there may be 2,000 people inside of each one and, intimately involved with what they're doing. And you say, suppose they got a very integrated system going on in here and these did here, but they weren't interoperable. So that's what happens. The CAD system in here, they can't share files. They got to have some way intermediate converted to come across into this. So in those, at that level, it's a problem. But the level of just the documents, what's going on, what you're doing, coordination, etc., like that is something that you just realize, look, it's just like for them to collaborate and talk, they have to have a really highly interoperable system that if you send me an email that tells me to go look at something in here that's open for me and I take a jump on that and go look, I have to be able to look around and study that and follow all the guides, etc., like that in this really new hyper way without changing my language.
Now, I'm sure what's going through people's minds at this point is the question of security. If you have these two organizations who are for this project collaborating but in other projects competing, how do they manage this interchange and interoperability that you're describing without violating security privilege?
It's done with paper to a large extent, or the actual computer models of the computer-aided design are carefully transferred and such. There has to be a lot of network systems security, and a lot of times they do it by just having this one be what they call a black hole that's in a big building and that's all screened and the computers are inside and no connections outside, and then a very special communication networks there that are encrypted to go between the two inside those two black holes. And so company A only has inside its black hole what it needs to share. So it's a very clumsy way. But so in that world of the future, there are lots of tough problems in getting there and standards, and the security and protection information and being able to share when you need and protect when you need is a very large problem.
Okay. So let's walk through this process a little bit more with these aerospace companies. You mentioned the fact that you've got a company working on one of these complex projects.
So as we point out, well, there may be 2,000 or 3,000 people inside the organization themselves, but that's not simple. You put together one of those big airplanes with having lots of suppliers that interact and supply, and you essentially do a lot of the assembly. And a first tier may be the person that's designing for you the special purpose landing gear or the radar or something for it. So there's a lot of high-level interaction with those. And these others down here, some of which these people call on and some of which are called on directly. So there's a lot of interaction going on in there, rapidity and comprehensiveness and legal character of it, etc., that I send you. If I can electronically send you a request for proposal and you can electronically bid and you can sign those things such that they're legally bound while you communicate them and keep them like that, this thing can move tremendously faster about the way it can exchange. So it's just the people that I started working with in there like that would picture all of this with just the kind of a system we brought to them, and they would just feel tremendous potential. And then the problem was, how do you get something like that commercial? It wasn't available commercially. All it was available on was this very old time-sharing host that we had implemented on.
Right. So there's obviously the need within this situation to have a better way to quickly move the information and make it available to these thousands and thousands of people working on projects across multiple organizations. But as you point out, it gets even more complex when you have a couple of companies working together on
these. They have
these.
to team closely. It's a very complex thing. But the thing is, if you look downstream about the alliances between organizations that are going to have to take place and the new kinds of economies that are coming about, and that's going to be prevalent. So that, and you have, I have other kinds of alliances and consortia and that going on. So the ability to interknit the actual knowledge work and ongoing dynamic Kodiak process is just mandatory. So it's an extremely important thing in the future, and there are many development research projects starting to produce technologies that will do some of that. But the problem is that they will solve local problems in probably unique ways.
The need for Kodiak interoperability will extend the scope of standards.
And the thing is, how soon can you get them to realize that that's the future they all have to evolve toward, and there's some extraordinary measures have to take place in order to move in that direction coherently.
Yeah. Now you're characterizing the problem as one of increasing complexity, multiple organizations, multiple people within organizations in an electronic networked world needing to share knowledge and information. And you're pointing out that there are lots of people beginning to chip away at this problem in niches. And we also see in the backdrop of the computer world a drive towards standards, standardization. Let's agree upon a set of standards that will allow us to have some kind of interoperability. However, in order to do what you've just been describing goes way beyond what I know of would be possible with today's standards efforts.
Correct.
So one of the things I hear you saying is we need a different kind of bigger way of thinking about standards. And while we're at it, let's take advantage of the work that I've been doing for 40 years and the experiential learning and understanding we have about what some of these issues are.
Right. And okay, accelerating the path to there are a number of things besides the standards. You have to, there's a big frontier. That's a very different new one that the world's just becoming aware of, to really live in this new way. There are many configurations of organization, of structure, of methods, of conventions, of skills, of language, of symbology that you could sort of say would populate different zones out there. So where do you want to go, and how are you going to explore that frontier? So the current market-driven process, the current way of exploring that is to sort of move almost everybody out like that, and then it's not going to make it good enough. And currently the vendors are sort of, the user organizations are sort of being passive and leaving it up to vendors. The vendors can't guess where they want to go. So there really has to be a new way to go after that if you want to do it, say, in 10 years rather than 30 or 50.
What if you want to do it in 2 years rather than 30 or 50?
That stretches even my imagination. No. The thing is, you could start doing things that get things coherently climbing the hill, and that's what I'm trying to get people to do. And so it'd be interesting to start describing the sort of framework of the hyper-document system that we built and employed, and got lots of experience to find a lot of value. And there's aspects in that aren't generally sort of in people's downstream image yet that we're telling.
And one of the things you're saying here is that let's take some of the principles that we've discovered in the augment system and apply them in the design of an open hyperdocument specification. What's the first beachhead for improving Kodiak capabilities? Hyperdocument systems. What's needed? Serious experimentation with hyperdocument systems.
Because we've had that out in large organizations of quite a few kinds, and some of those intense pilot operations just taught a lot. So.
Okay, well, let's take a look at what some of those capabilities were. The essential elements of an open hyperdocument system. Shared online filing.
Well, we set it up to sort of represent the kind of Kodiak situation, and we'll go through it in stages of development. So if these are individual participants in some Kodiak common domain, these can be individuals with their files or other organizational units, and this is the shared one like this. So the very first thing that comes to mind is to have a file server out there that you can share files, and this is getting to be quite common today. So that's where we started, but the very, very outset in trying to do what we wanted to do was we had a structured, special kind of documents in here that what you'd call structured hypertext.
Structuring, linking, and viewing.
So the next slide shows that that's an immediate difference from what would be generally available today, in that there's actually shared things where these are dynamically evolving files that have a special structuring capability into them, so you can move about and view them very flexibly. And the linkages let you put citations at any place in one that cites a specific passage in another. So the mobility of moving around in that, and then once you get to a point, the flexibility in getting an idea of what the context was in that document and studying it if you wish, was just very, very high. So this was a first start. So we had that by 1968 very flexibly.
Okay,
And
but
these
what
are-
you're talking about here is more, sounds like it's much more than what I get today with some of the hypertext implementations that have been done. Because today there are systems where you can put a pointer from one file to another file.
Mhm.
You said that there is structure in these documents or in these files that you can use to address very specifically
Yes.
where those pointers go, and there's also context and different ways that you can use that structure to help you view the files or documents. Can we talk a little bit more about
Right,
those?
That stemmed from, as I mentioned, that framework that evolved in the early 60s, where if one looked at what expected this technology might do in changing the things in the human environment, I just happened to start thinking about the language aspect, and then realizing that the language depends upon our ability in our minds to deal with concepts, but we've attached symbols in our minds so that then we can think and speak and communicate. And if we find ways to externalize those symbols in ways in some media that we can hand around and helps us think and review, that was a very large step. And then printing and publishing helped a lot. Well, I was looking for the candidate changes in the human system side, and I just began to think, well, you know, one thing you could do is you could make a much better map of what's the conceptual structure in your mind in external symbols held inside a computer than you ever could on paper, because you could explicitly have all sort of structural elements. Today they would call them objects in that, like that, and you could have them related any way you wanted with all kinds of pointers and interconnections and in detail, etc., like that. And so you said, well, that's a much better map. What could I do with it? And I could move around, and I could also, as with a computer-aided design system, I have the actual structure of the object inside the computer, and I can ask the computer to show me lots of views of it that are handy and move around. So you say, why not? The same way with what you think of as a document, the content of your externalized concepts, etc. So that's what we decided to build. And then moving around, you said, well, if those objects sort of provide a landscape that you can think about it and what's related to what and where it's located in that document. So you begin to realize having location addresses would be important. So we started providing that. And it's the kind of location address that if you rearrange your document, everything gets a new address. Well, that's all right. But then you would decide, well, each of those objects can have a permanent identifier that when it's created, the computer gives it, and you can address it by that. When addressing it means I could either jump to it, or I could say I want to move that someplace or copy it, and I wouldn't necessarily have to click on it and point it. I could give it by any designation I wish.
And you're saying that the addressability of the objects, and these objects, of course, could be paragraphs of text, or they could be graphics, or they could be images, or they could be...
Or a component in a graphic.
Okay, a single component in a graphic. But the actual addressing of those, the address of each object, is that something that I as a human being have to think about and do, or is that something that the system automatically does for me?
The system can provide it, and then you can use it as you wish.
Okay, great.
And it's like the municipal system puts house numbers on houses. And you can use it if you wish to tell somebody how to get to a certain house or send a letter to it. Or you can say, if you go to 4th and Main and go west on 4th until you find the second yellow house on the left, that's another way, relatively speaking. You give an exact address and then something relevant. Or you can say, hey, someplace on 4th west of Main you can find Joe lives. Go ask for Joe. So there are all these sort of potentials, and you use it every day.
So if I could extrapolate from what you just said, what you're calling for in an open hyperdocument system, a modern-day implementation of these principles, is that we would have that kind of addressability across systems, across all kinds of objects, across all kinds of architectures, and it would be at the level not just of being able to have a name for an object, but actually knowing its relative position vis-a-vis other objects in that domain.
That
right?
there'd be a number of ways to address it, which means uniquely you could specify, I either want to go look at it or have something done with it. Like
Okay.
this. So, yes, so there are quite a few more than I've described, and we built that into it.
Let's take a look at how it actually looked.
Sure. Here's a document we published some years ago that actually describes a good deal of the internal structure and name and everything like that. So this is a typical page. And so we began to say, well, why not? We had a hierarchical arrangement of these objects, and we call them paragraphs if you wish. And so out here at the right-hand margin, we would actually then just print what we call the location number for that. And it begins to be that, oh, I can look at this hard copy, then I could specify in an email or something to somebody else, go look at that passage, because the citation would be to the particular document, right, to the given passage. And in this case, the document is put into the journal, which we have yet to describe like that. So it's frozen and given this access thing on every page up here like that. So all I need to do if I'm interested in some passage is look at the unique document spec and where it is in there, and I can immediately know I've got a handle on it. So you say, well, why? If you can go and look at it and scroll to it and point to it, you want to do that. The power that's in it when you've got this extra flexible capability at your choice is quite large.
Okay. Now, one of the things that power gives you is the ability to view the document a whole bunch of different ways,
Let's
right?
look at this one again.
Okay.
It's as though if I just said to somebody, go to branch 7, and when you get there, look at it with a specific view. But then what we're going to show you is a few that actually with this file, with a window that's a specific size, and this is what would happen. So we say, well, put on the numbers, that's one view, show me the whole content to just shape up on that particular window size, and that's what you would see, a jump. You could have a citation link that would just take you right to there to see that view.
Right to 7A within 7. Okay, now what if I
Right
didn't...
to 7, but then showing the view that shows you as much as it can of what's going on after 7.
Right.
Wide open. But then if you
Okay.
might say, oh, I can't tell what's below, so why don't I change the view to just show me the first line of every paragraph?
Okay.
And that's what you'd see. It says, oh, hey, that's great. But as a matter of fact, when I went there, I said, I only want to see the levels, 7 or 1 below it. And so you'd see it like that. You say, oh, that's very handy. I can see the orientation and the context that's in. And then the next one it says, well, maybe something's below. Open up one more level. So we had all this working in the mid-'60s. So it's just the basic way, a few of the basic characteristics. And we could also give each one of these nodes arbitrary label or name anytime you wanted to that could be used in accessing. And also the citation links that could be embedded in there. You had relative names, so you could have an address that said, go to 7, go down a level 1 and to its successor, and take the link that's there, and when you get there, da-da-da. So all that could be in one address, so that indirect routing. There are just many very powerful applications. So these are part of what evolved through the years, and the applicability of that in these very heavy complexes would just very large.
Now, you've talked about the implementation of an object structure, or structured documents that know about objects and have addressability, and that you can use that addressability to give you capabilities, like to have different views, to be able to link directly to them. Now, since we're talking about this kind of an architecture in the context of an open hyperdocument system that would span computer systems and applications, what happens if I'm sitting in my computer system, in my organization, and I now am interacting with your computer system and your organization, maybe in a different country even, and we share this new architecture, this new open hyperdocument characteristics and understanding? I would therefore be able to link directly to a particular paragraph or place or graphic. How would my application know, and me as a human being, know what to do once I actually got there?
Yeah, that's a big, very problem. The link you may have gotten there could have been provided by any number of means. Somebody's sending you something to say, go look at this or whatever. But that's the big issue about interoperability. They can make links all right that it could go, and maybe, we're assuming that you want to be able to link to any specific object granularity, not just to a whole document or to a page.
Right.
And incidentally, pages just have no meaning in this kind of environment. It's the conceptual structure that you're interested in, and pages are an extremely artificial thing to put on it. So it's only when someone wants to publish something on hard copy that we ever get involved with pages, it seems.
Right.
So anyway, that is the real question. You jump into the middle of somebody else's, and maybe their link got you there. But if they have a different set of conventions for the way they structure it and what the different symbols for how to move around are, you're lost. It's almost as if you could transport yourself very quickly, and suddenly, because you saw something about some interesting architecture, and boom, you were in this village in Yugoslavia. Okay, how do you get around there suddenly to find out, because it's totally different description and language, etc., like that. You said that, all the different languages, etc., I have to learn, and the conventions would just spoil the real power of that. So the future has got to be that those get to be standard conventions, a core set of standard conventions, the symbology that deals with it, or you diminish tremendously the interoperable capability of what your world of knowledge can be used by me.
Okay, can you just explain for me a little bit more about what kind of conventions those would have to be?
Well, for instance, there's bound to be a lot of value in having different types of links. So if we don't have the same meaning about and same types, and hopefully the same descriptive terms that we use for those links, then we run into real trouble. I get in there and you've got buttons or whatever it is, and I can click on those, and they just don't align up with my subset of things. And it's as if in different languages, you say, if I get an artificial intelligence thing that will transliterate, they'll tell me what that word means. But very often they don't mean enough the same so that you get into trouble as you start using them. So the link types are very much of a one, and where you find them, etc.
What about the conventions that the other system might use in terms of command language? Well,
usually you associate the term command with the sort of vehicle or instrument that's you're looking at or moving or manipulating the objects in there like that. So aside from that, they can have a totally different look and feel about with their vehicle moving around and creating these things or manipulating it. But what needs to be consistent is the sort of names for the objects in there and the things you can do with them. And if you're part of the same organization in the same Kodiak kind of environment, you all have to share that same terms like that. But you can indeed have different looks and feel, and this maybe well as an evolutionary encouragement. At least some people have, there'll be widely different grades of proficiency involved with some people. So the people that are highly proficient should have a free, large vocabulary with very efficient ways to evoke it, and something like that. So the vocabulary control is a very important one for any one enterprise. And when you share them, then they have to find out more and more about the conventions for structure and linkages and guides, and if you're going to have footnotes or footnotes and footnotes, how you signify them and where you expect to find the notations. Those have to grow and the vocabulary is slightly different from that. But those all have to be, to get up there for the kind of open systems we need, we have to explore a lot of different applications to find out what you need in those applications to be really proficient in them, and then generalize on that before you freeze standards.
Okay, so what we're evolving to then in this organic evolutionary way is a set of agreed upon standard vocabularies and standard semantics and standard grammar that describe the behavior of these different objects across systems. And what you're saying is that that's something that we need to work on together, and we need to evolve it, and we need to evolve it across different knowledge disciplines.
Yes.
Integrated electronic mail. Okay, great. Let's go back to your original augment system. We've talked a lot about documents and sharing of files. Let's talk about the integrated electronic mail system you had back in those days.
All right. Well, in the 60s, we built this environment, and by 1970, we added this, a full-featured mail system, in which any object being mailed was just a part of this, hyperdocument environment.
What did you mean by throwaway mail there?
Well, it's the kind that no one knows quite what to do with it when you get it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the problems. I send you an email item, and 2 weeks later, I want to send you something that extends it. How much can I depend upon the fact that you can get that other one? And if I not sure you can, do I send a copy or just give you a lot of context,
Mm-hmm.
et cetera? So the problem of who's responsible for, or if anyone is, for knowing that there was another one that I can refer to.
Okay, so maintaining the record of the correspondence
Yeah, it's
that's taken
difficult.
place between us.
Yeah, and I don't know very many people who do it in such a way. You might get these identifiers about this mail item, but who employs that in order to cite the
Mhm.
thing? So we said, all right, that's one thing that was quite valuable. But what we want, and it's very, very valuable if you have it. Really is. It's a form of your hyper document kind of thing. So you can send an email thing that, for instance, has a link to some item in a shared file or to another message. It just amplifies the value immensely.
A journal system. Tell us about the journal and how that worked.
All right, this it seemed to me in the late 60s would be very important. You have these files that evolve, et cetera, and you can never count very much on a file. If you say, I'm writing a proposal right now and I send it out, or a proposal inside about a given project status, and where do you put it?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you guarantee that if someone wants to talk about it, they can go find what it was that you authored at that time? And I got to thinking of it as sort of like the transactions in any kind of a system, that you'd keep a journal that you could go back and see exactly what transacted at a given time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I picked the name, the journal, for the system, that one can take any size of document, and through a process that's very similar to the mail, to send a mail, you can send that document, and among many fields that are available for you to put into when you transmit something then would be a couple of them special for this. One says it's to go into Journal X, and you could have any number of administratively established journals around in the system. And
So they may have to do with customers, they might have to do with projects that you're working on, that kind of thing, classification?
Right. It's something to learn about what you said, but it's almost like libraries or something.
Okay.
And so you send it to a particular journal, and it takes the document and puts it away. It's a system that's part automatic and part people administered. And it stores it away and guarantees that any time you ask for it by its identifier. And when it gets journaled, it's given an identifier number from that journal. That's unique. And any time after that, the system asks for that, it gets back guaranteed original, just like you published it.
Integrated external document management. What do you do about information that is not on the system? Can we talk
Well,
about that in the
yes.
same context?
Yes, we wanted to keep track of that. We call it external documents or offline documents. So the journal would have a catalog in here that would have descriptors for every given object that was put into there. So the catalog, if you asked for a given number, it would go there and look, and among the things there, it'd find out where it is. But also could keep track of who all's other things entered in there that are pointing at this one with links, and different kind of keywords, et cetera, in there for searching. Well, we said, why not assign similar things in the catalog to these external documents? And even though you can't search them online, et cetera, what you can do is that helps you control them and keeping track of them, because you can stamp that number on them, or you could use a barcode scanning, and helps you do the records management of those things. But it also helps you retrieve by content, by title or subject, et cetera, and know what number you're looking for. You can just store them by number.
Right.
And I used to do that with my correspondence. I get it
Well,
all
let's
stored.
talk about that specifically.
But
Let's
one
make
important
this...
thing here, though, just to
Yeah.
notice is when any one of these gets referred to by something in the journal, then its catalog item for that object will tell you that these two things are now talking about it. So it starts involving them in the dialogue quite effectively.
It's also a great way throughout the architecture to know which of the information that's sitting in this knowledge base is information that is being accessed and used by people, as opposed to the things that are hanging out there that really
Right.
aren't being referenced by anybody and maybe would be candidates for taking offline.
Well, the system would automatically, if they weren't, if nobody accessed them for a given period of time, they were the ones candidate when you needed a space on the disk that would get dropped to tape.
Great.
But we had this thing working over 20-some host servers around the networks, and one of the journals was universal among them all, so that you submit something in the journal, and what people get is a citation, an email citation that arrives to them that says, oh, the journal, and it was sent to you or copied to you, and here are the different fields, and it supersedes something else, etc. And by the way, here's the link to it, and that's all it needs. So if you wanted to see it, you just clicked on it to go look at the library copy.
That's great. So instead of people sending me articles that they think I might be interested in or whatever, they would just send me the citation,
Mm-hmm.
they put it in the journal, and send the citation out to the distribution list of people who might be interested in looking at it.
Right. And
Okay.
it's just very tidy. Then you don't have to keep it.
Right.
And you can just keep a list of the interesting ones if you want to, or you can always go to the catalog and find them.
Right. Okay. Let's give a living example here of you brought some information, some examples with you. I mean, we've been talking about this kind of esoterically in computer architectural terms, but let's talk about it in the real world.
Sure.
How does it work?
Well, in the real world, you know, I to go buy one of these and manage it. And, well, it might be one of the external documents, and it gets a number. And so when people start talking about it, this is a very interesting book that's relevant to all this thing. Or if somebody wants to make a citation online, it would have the same form and talk about a given page, things like that. And then the catalog would tell you, when you look in the catalog of this thing, how many people are talking about it and what are they saying. Well, this doesn't have the capability of finding and here's citations that you can actuate. So you say, well, it's only a matter of time till these things are published online, and you go look at it and bomb off. So the commentary on it all becomes folded in. Well, you can find other things, though. You say, well, the same way with the professional journals that come out. And this one happens to be talking about concurrent engineering, which, by the way, is something that all the concurrency of working on here just says, oh, why big deal about concurrent engineering? It's concurrent everything. And this Kodiak concurrency thing will make a big impact inside the concurrent engineering too. But then you'd expect you could just pop right to not only to the journal, but to an article, but not just to an article, to a passage when it's online, and that could cite something else. You move off. This one might cite something that ends up, you say, oh, the equivalent of my online catalog, and boom, you go to a given piece of the catalog, which is a very big thing in the manufacturing and engineering world, that the processes and things that are available, and who has what commentary about a process, or a supplier that can do things for you of various kinds. So many of the real intelligence base gets a lot more. The sort of very interesting flyers that come around like that will begin to be online, that start people that make very interesting commentary, etc., on things, and they're interlinking. And the Seybold newsletters and things would even come through that way, linked to a lot of stuff. And conferencing. So here's the very important conference coming up, the Hypertext 91, and it's a very nice brochure. And it was delivered email around those too, but who can use that effectively? But it goes into when it goes into the journal, it's just something where I could just send you an email and say to you, Patty, there's a session that's very interesting. There'll be a link right to that, and you look through it, or you see people that are on there, and you have a way to dive back into the intelligence collection to see, hey, where else is that name of that person or the project there going on? That starts to be involved in that. Then people go to a conference like this and they come back. And if they're in an organization that requires trip reports, they'll write up a trip report. And then what happens to it? Well, now it can go into the Kodiak intelligence collection environment and just be a very dynamic tool that is referenceable at any time in the coming years that, boom, are findable. So the accumulation of that begins to grow. The thing about that we also do is if we have documents that somehow get into the journal that are that kind, and there's one kind of process I've done that I like to have these around my desk for a while if I don't have always the access to around the system like this. So I just had some 10-tab cardboard finder things with a staple on the back of it, and I would put the number of the journal on here with the tab associated with the tab number that was the last digit on there. So these things all stack up in a little holder like that, and I know I'm looking for something that ends with a 9. I go right down and grab it, It's a very, very easy way to manage this sort of stuff. And the same thing could be done with your external document kind of thing. So
Right.
these are all just sort of trivial little methodological and convention sorts of things, but they're there to explore. And it's a very different comprehensive environment.
Yeah.
You can get a letter from somebody, something like that. Or that, I think, is
Yeah, that's very clear because it shows me both the way it works today in the real world and the fact that I don't have any way to interlink and reference and cite that kind of information, and also that I could begin to build this kind of environment if I had the right tools, and I could include in it all that kind of externally generated information into that reference. Shared screen support. Now, we've talked about a number of the principles of the augment system now that relate to the open hyperdocument specification or standard that we're trying to evolve and get people involved in helping us specify. There's one other aspect to the system that I wanted to, your original augment system, I wanted you to just talk about for a minute, which is the idea of a shared screen. There was a particular architecture that that system used that made it easy for you to do that shared screen function. Can you describe that real briefly? And
yeah, well,
what
there, for a number of reasons, we were building what's essentially the client-server relationship here, and that we wanted to build out and support.
And when was this?
In the mid-'70s.
So in the mid-'70s you were already doing client-server.
Yeah, we'd had our third or fourth generation of that, and a full-featured remote procedure call protocol that, as far as I know, was the first one out there. And a virtual terminal specification that your applications worked into that is somewhat equivalent to Windows. So, but in that, one of the very important features was the provision for you to be able to share windows or share screens. And so that independent, application-independent user interface module just made a very nice way to do that, because you could get that with a link to any network like that, so your screen could be showing whatever the other guy's screen were, and you could pass controls back and forth and put 2, 3, 4 people doing this. So the coaching or supervising would work very well.
What else could I do with that shared screen capability besides just looking at somebody else's
Oh, the
computer?
assumption is it's fully operable. So you're sharing the full operational capability of whatever that application can do in those windows, so that you can, somebody can come along and show you how to make a design or make a change, or your supervisor can come along and show you what he wants, or you can show him what you've done and do it, or an expert can come in as a coach and just say, come on, let's try it this way, I'll show you, and take over the controls and do it. So it's, or you concurrently edit something together, and then you can sign off on it because you've both agreed right on the spot.
So in other words, everybody who had their screens linked together in this way across a network could be seeing the identical information and application and be interacting, and you'd pass the controls from one person to another in terms of who was leading and coaching.
And you didn't have to know how to run or have access to that application, as a matter of fact. It could be shared.
Okay. An example that I could think of that would be real useful today is would be in a, let's say you had a biologist working with molecular models in 2 different parts of the world, and one of them's working, has a particular one they want to show the other guy, and it's a 3D molecular model. The ability to share the screen across a network and be able to look at the characteristics and talk about them and interact with them, even though this is my science that I'm doing. It may be a whole discipline that you're not familiar with,
Right.
but I can lead you through it, guide you through it.
And the executives that you can't count on learning enough but need support, it's the equivalent of their helicopter pilot. You link with them and take them around. But we've just assumed that that was going to be everybody's end image of what their systems are going to be like. So it was strange and through the 70s and 80s not to find that emerging. And now it seems still slowly, as some people provide it as a special feature, but it needs to be built into the integrated architecture, clearly.
A common evolving vocabulary among Kodiak users.
So that, and also the provisions that the actual nouns and verbs and qualifiers that are associated with your interface working have to be under the control of the whole organization's coordinated thing, and they can't be sort of provided by the vendors according to how they think in those open systems. So the architecture needs it that you've got a grammar-driven user interface styles still what choice you want of what style, look and feel you have,
Mhm.
but the actual verbs and nouns and adjectives and such that are underlying and are explicitly in your menus or anything like that just have to be uniform across the organizations. So you have to sort of shift the style about that the vendors aren't the ones that provide that. They provide a lot of the application and all that.
So what you're saying then is that at that open hyperdocument specification level, we need specifications that are agreed upon for that underlying grammar.
Yeah, that's a more general thing. That goes
Yeah.
for all the applications you're going in there. So that and the shared screen are just architectural general things that are inevitable, seems to me. Right.
Okay, let's summarize some of these essential elements of an open hyperdocument system that we've talked about. We won't go through all of them here, but we've talked about the shared window conferencing, we've talked about interlinking between hyperdocuments and other kinds
Like
of data and information.
CAD systems or databases, right?
Right. We've talked about the need for the hard copy print option so that you can look at information that is referenced in a journal and be able to navigate across. Is there anything else on this list? For example, something that we haven't touched on yet, but people are getting very interested in today's technology is no-bots and agents.
Yeah.
How does that fit into this open hyperdocument world?
Well, the openness of it leads to saying that, yes, there are lots of places for special utilities that people can supply. And the standardization that'll there be about the objects, their structures, their relations, and all of that in there means that then you have a market for smart agents that can start doing things. And not letting the smart agent or something like that be the thing that leads the whole parade. The people in their way of working inside of these knowledge workshop that they're going to have, get their methods and all that working. So it's like, I'm going to fly my airplanes and have all my schedules and the missions and everything else like that done by hand, and then I'm going to start learning how I can get automatic pilots and stuff, start emerging into that. And as you bring in these smart ones like that, you'll find that there'll be a lot of subtle or quite even unsubtle changes that you can make in the actual conventions and methods by which you run your work. But you have to get in that evolutionary mode before you can start doing that sensibly. So you say, yes, it's very important to get some kind of standard environment, architecture, and conventions going and start learning what you can do about harnessing smarter.
Okay, so that takes care of things like smart agents and robots and no-bots and so on.
Very important.
They fit into this environment or this paradigm. What about current-day product directions and specific products like Lotus Notes or from Action Technologies, the coordinator, the kind of conversation management capabilities? How do you see them evolving into this kind of open hyperdocument environment?
In the end, they'll all be part of the utilities and utilization inside of an open hyperdocument environment, the standard. And you can't picture them surviving by having each one has its own special type of file structure and all of that, or interface. So they'll be integrated, and they're very important aspects of what's going to come.
Okay,
And,
so that's important for all of these suppliers to work together.
It's very important, and it leads to a very, very basic question of who's supposed to take the lead in trying to provide that kind of uniformity. And I don't think there's any precedent yet for something that will have that kind of global requirement and terrifically pervasive applicability as this kind of system goes. And so it comes out to the point of saying that the end user organizations just have to take a much more proactive position in leading the way to explore the future. It's not just a technical exploration by any means.
Okay, so you're very clear about the fact that it's time now to pass the control over to the end user organizations. This kind of Kodiak concurrent knowledge environment is upon us. It's going to require a new set of thinking and cooperation and collaboration about how we as end users want to work together collaboratively, the kind of tools we need, the kind of vocabulary we need, et cetera, and we need to start working together within our organizations and across organizations to make that happen. Now, you've also given a lot of thought to that whole process of how people can be more effective within their organizations and across organizations. Let's begin to talk now about that human systems side and its integration and co-evolution. But first, let's go back to our agenda here, just so people will see where we are. We've talked about high-performance organizations. We've talked about the Kodiak architecture. We just finished talking about the open hyperdocument system. Now, what I'd like to do is begin to talk about this notion of whole system augmentation. And let's start with the basics.
Yeah. Go back to 1960.
Okay.
I said, hey, you're trying to make people a lot more effective. And so I said, well, what are you building on? So I made this little box and said, well, that's a human. And the kind of thing the outside world sees is, well, that human has a lot of sensory and perceptual mechanism that you can just categorize as being perceived. It can perceive and digest outside. The motor things that can actuate the outside world. So that's the way it affects the outside world, and that's the way it gets its information about it. And we can play tag.
Right.
And then you say it's supposedly guided by a mental process. So as part of it is conscious and part of it's unconscious. And it's interesting through the years how, as I watch more and more things that go on by people doing is the relative size of the unconscious and conscious. This little circle of conscious capabilities keeps getting smaller relative. Because there's so many things about our perception of the outside world and our choice and what we do about it that we're not really conscious of, which is one of the big issues we get involved. But so this is the human, and he's got these basic mental, motor, perceptual capabilities. How is it going to do anything with the world? Well, the only way it can really be effective in the world is when it's provided with things that fall into these three zones. You say, well, I get language and culture and a lot of socialization, et cetera, in here, and a lot of that's unconscious as I get built in and explicit. And I learn a lot of skills, perceptual and motor, and you can really point out how much skill it is. Just try to use a rearview mirror, and you realize that's a skill you have to learn.
Yeah.
And so anyway, but then there's a lot of stuff out here, and all the tools, I started listing them. All the tools, and I finally said all kinds of artifacts and all sorts of things like organizations and roles and conventions and cultural things. So the end was that all three of these things comprise a system that augments the basic human capability. That's the only thing that makes it capable of dealing with that in the outside world. So that's the system you want to focus on if you're going to improve it. So going on from there is a big step in this next diagram. Of saying, well, here's the basic human capabilities and skills and knowledge by which it's trained and indoctrinated and all of that. And then you have capabilities that stem from a lot of technology things. And if we're really talking about knowledge work, which we're focusing on here, there are a lot of these things that are provided, evolving. And it's also all these things that I lumped with the human system, which these are just a small list. So it's the sum of all of these things that the human's trained in that gives them augmented. And he has lots of capabilities here that generally are multi-level capabilities, where higher level capabilities really depend upon being able to coordinate the execution of lower level capabilities. And you can make the same model with organizations. And looking at that very hard for months back in the 61 and 62, evolved a framework that was just very, very valuable. So the types of evolution, the processes, how many stakeholders in a large organization are involved with the changing of any significant capability, the realization that the scale of change in functional capability and speed and capability that the new technology is providing in here over the last couple of decades, it's just an overwhelming scale change. To think that that's only going to have some automation effects over here is just, trivial. And it's just not thinking through that this side, when it learns how to harness this, there'll be a lot of evolution over here for generations to learn how to harness it. These things aren't God-given. They evolve through lots of coevolution through many, many, many generations, and suddenly when this thing appears so abruptly, that thing is just wide open for evolution. And the co-evolution of these two things is just absolutely critical.
And
So-
what's your feeling about where we are today in the computer industry in terms of the balance between human systems and tool systems and the kind of attention we pay in organizations to those?
Well, we go along like this. It's badly listening. And
On the side of
Yes.
the tools,
Right.
that we're spending a lot of time and effort on tool system capabilities and very little time and effort on human system capabilities.
you just think of how much more R&D is going on over here for innovating in here than there is over here.
And your point is that if we could shift, if we could list back over in this direction and start worrying about really driving, having our human behavior and our organizational goals and our working
No,
together.
I'm not advocating shifting from here to here.
Right,
It's co-evolving.
okay.
Because there are people in the human processes and organizational processes and such as that that are almost as bad as the techies over here are saying, we'll decide what the processes should be and then tell you guys what to automate. When they may not have any idea of all of the possibilities for things over here that could be innovated to support new kinds of things here. So they really have to co-evolve.
Let's talk about the ABCs of organizational improvement.
All right. This was a sort of a conceptual abstraction that I found necessary if I were going to different organizations saying, I have a strategy about how you can improve your organization, and whom do I talk to? And that they wouldn't know. And then I began realizing that 2 years ago that there was really a big movement in the quality in the country, and that quality movement generally carried with it that if you were going to be serious about it, you had to have continuous improvement program.
Right.
And I began realizing that's what's missing. So when I make a model of this kind here, I made 3 different categories of activities, not saying it's functional units or something. I'd say you might have your hat on, a B hat on for 2 hours a week or whatever, so it's activity. And A is the kind of core business activity that you just associate with the way everything runs. It's the product development or the selling activity, the human resources development or the hiring or whatever. It's what makes it fun. But any time you spend any activity to improve your capability to do the A, categorize that as B. So all the investment and the activity, whether it's 10 minutes a week you spend or some people are full-time, to improve the capability for A, that's B. And then that's when it becomes really important. You come in and say, who's in charge of B? And I've got a better way to do it, or I've got lots of good things to offer you. Well, you find out that, hey, there's nobody then, unless you have somebody that's doing C, that is somebody, some activity is responsible to maybe install, but at least improve the B activity, you're still not going to stuck. So if you look at these 3, then thinking of a framework for how you're going to approach the transforming the organizations we're talking about, you begin to really see, you say, wow, there's some tremendous challenges for this B out there in the future. And to do that, we've got to get something going in C that keeps getting that better and better. And this is the kind of orientation 30 years ago that led to the bootstrapping, because I was saying, oh, hey, well, that's a very complex, B and C are very complex challenges. Oh, I was interested in doing complex, improving complex capabilities. So he says, all right, if C is in providing new things to offer B, so B can help that, and it's the things that in turn would help C. You
Okay,
get
so
bootstrapping.
what we're talking about here then is the C activity has to do with improving the improvement capabilities of the B
Right.
activity, which is improving the core activities of the business. And you're saying, put your focus here on improving the improving capabilities.
I'm saying, if the early things you bring in for innovation of new capability improvements can be applied to C itself, then it'll start lifting itself up.
Okay.
So that was a big reason for choosing the Kodiak, and it's very, very highly applicable to that.
So then what happens?
Well, then you also say, if the early things, a lot of things B does to improve A, in stronger, solid, more widely distributed ways and stuff, can actually be employed both in B and C, you get further. You start the second derivative, if you wish, talking about like that. So these were the images I had, and then I said, well, if you're an information system vendor or some kinds of integrators or some kinds of consultants, the very thing that you're taking out into the world as a product, if that is something that can be utilized by improving its own capability, and B, C, you get all these other things. So that for some of the progressive vendor organizations, they can do much better than a user organization which can only do this. The vendor organization has a lot more capability. So in the sense when we say the user organization is the one that have to really get going, well, if a vendor organization turns itself into a user organization really seriously, then it's got much better chance for learning and moving ahead. So
Okay.
that's the offer.
If I am going to focus on improving the improvement capabilities of my B people, and I'm going to, or my B activity, because it may be different consciousness that the same people are using, and within my organization I begin to work at this level, as you're suggesting, then, and there are other people in other organizations that begin to do the same thing because they begin to follow your bootstrapping principles, then what happens?
Well, then you can say, well, if I'm a large organization and I have different divisions, I can say, hey, let's share some of this C work. These things are very often quite specific in an engineering or manufacturing or something would take explicit that, but there's so much in common in the C. And this is, all right, let's share a lot of the C across the whole company. And this would make called a C community. And that's a very important thing to do. And if you're really going after early to get improved Kodiak capability, what better place to invest your early things in here, because that's just what it needs to do, starting to get the information from these guys, integrate it into better handbooks for the bees to operate, bringing information to the outside world, evolve some systems to give it. It's just a beautiful prototype application for that. And so if you say, well, there's so much in C actually that's cross-organizational, oh, you say, well, if these are separate corporations doing that, it's also extremely, very high payoff looking like that. So that's the kind of thing that if people got going, they could really do. But a given organization can employ this or start with a simpler model like that. But the real potential for organizations, they need some kind of strategy to cope with the complexity of this evolutionary process. If they assume that there's going to be a lot to gain and a lot of change involved in gaining it, they need a strategy for going. So this is what we're doing, is raising a flag and saying, well, we've worked on this strategy for a long time. Let us start talking with you to say, hey, how would this strategy fit your organization? And let's start to see if we can develop an actual plan to implement and pursue that.
Describe for me, give me an example, not an information systems architecture example, another example, if you could, of an organization's A, B, and C strategy. Let's say I call you up, Doug Engelbart, and I say, I like this idea. I'd like you to come and help me figure out who is my C community, or what it is, and how to find it, what I should do with it, what's the B I'm trying to improve, what's the A activity. How would you go about doing that? What would you be looking for?
Well, an early one is who's responsible. And another important thing that I found is, is the responsibility up high enough so that they can really start talking about that at a strategic level? Because you'd have endless cycles of makeshift fix-it things if the people have to do it at some relatively low level, and they're in a position where it's a tactical fix that you have to make to improve a given problem like that. So if you don't have it so you're cumulatively learning, et cetera, you're no better off. So.
Okay, so the first question you'd ask me then is, who is your person in charge of continuous improvement for the entire organization, or who is your person in charge of organizational learning, or whatever that organization calls that?
Yeah, you'd have to come down and say, whatever shape your B is in, who's responsible for C? And can we get at a strategic level? See, don't just tell me that it's this vice president's part-time job or something like that. To develop a strategy for that change is on a parallel in importance to the strategy for your product line and the strategy for how you finance or what market segments you're going after. The strategy by which you're going to climb in the hill to make your organization increasingly capable is very important. So
that's a strategic investment.
Right, and it needs strategic thinking and strategic people. So that's where you have to get going. It's very often sidetracked into saying, well, I tell you, let's try that out down here, and we'll see how it works.
Right. And you've now convinced me that I'm going to take this very seriously, and I'm going to make a strategic investment in improving my organizational effectiveness and improving my organization's ability to improve itself. And I'm now putting my attention there. And one of the things that I hear you saying is that in order to really do this effectively on the tool system side and the combination, the coevolution of the human system side and the tool system side, I need to start working towards, within my organization, a Kodiak-like environment in order to do that. Now, how can I work with you in order to understand what the implications of that are for my organization?
I'm sure it varies with organizations, but the most direct thing that can be done is to start saying, how do I provide myself with a succession of prototype hyperdocument systems that are aiming to work for the general solution of the Kodiak. It just comes out over and over again as the biggest payoff strategic lever that you could do.
Okay.
And you can sort of scan for what products come close, but that gives you some experience but doesn't give you the evolutionary capability. So somehow you say, well, what we need is an evolving prototype application where we can start populating that frontier with real pilot outposts. So we learn what's needed. And so we're not too hasty about saying, oh, here's the standards we need.
Right.
And the vendor organizations need to get involved too. That their problem in investing so much money in bringing a product out and that, and just guessing at where in that frontier they think things are going to go. And if the user organizations are passive about it, it's very unfair and
and unrewarding.
Yes. So this is the thing that very soon any progressive large organization would find out that it'd be very important to start building alliances in this ABC strategic bootstrapping with other organizations so that you can A, sort of share the cost of bringing these prototypes out, and B, get some mass about your shared experiences that can start doing some rational effect on the standards processes. And you don't want to start a new one. There are lots of standards organizations that you want to start connecting with. In fact, some of them can be candidate for pilot use of this thing downstream, in effect.
Right.
So there are many things that you can extend the thought about. If you make this a real Kodiak pilot, the way people from the B activity can come and live in this environment to help make it work and then rotate back. And the fact that much of what you can do in here can be done by people sitting in their home offices, actually side by side with the kind of B people they're supposed to help. Those are characteristics about the improvement transfer process and the understanding and the knowledge flowing both ways that are very important, and they all just fall right into the basic Kodiak process and planning.
Doug, I really like what you've been talking about here today, and I'd like to participate. As a company, I'd like to get involved. What can I do? How can we work together?
Well, there are a couple of stages that need to be proved out. And what I'd say the first one is that you need to identify a responsible C, a core C activity, just to say who's going to be responsible, and it needs to be somebody at a strategically high level.
So who's responsible in my organization for improving our organizational improvement capability?
Process, right. You know, for it's establishing it, getting it going, husbanding it through the years. So then the next thing, once that's clear, is that I really need a chance to work with them over several months probably in interacting to co-develop the kind of framework, integrate this kind of framework into their environment and the strategy to develop their framework and their strategy that sort of meets their world. And you have to find the kind of main stakeholders around the organization that need to participate in order for anything to get moving.
Right.
You just can't twist it from the top.
Right.
So if you get that process going, that represents the sort of internal core C. So then you say, all right, you've got a framework to get going. All right, then make an action plan, and that And probably the next step would be, if they're fairly progressive about it, they've realized by that time that that's too big for them alone, really, if they're going to start swinging things out there in the standards. And the number of things to learn, if you're really going to integrate a lot of stuff about C, how do you set up pilots, a whole thing about how to combat inertia, the changing people's perception of, paradigms, et cetera. There are many, many very tough things you have to just start assimilating. You need a lot of partners.
Yeah.
So start finding alliances that are natural. And then that's a very important. And then down the line comes place, if you really want to make something like this get started, you have to explicitly start launching a vector about advanced Kodiak capability. If for the bootstrapping, we need to work. And I think that means you'd have to start implementing prototype hyperdocument systems that have a chance of evolving to be open, and deploying them and using them. And that, for a while, even though that's only a part of the whole improvement thing you have to get going, is by far the best, strongest lever.
Mm-hmm.
You get that moving, and then a lot more can start happening about all the other aspects. The quality movement, for instance, can start to be affected later very much. Software engineering, just a whole bunch of very explicit things would begin to happen. The ideas people have about the learning organization, God, that's the basis. Your handbook is the knowledge you're passing up the line. The handbook's going up the line. So all the tools and processes within the Kodiak, you have to have a way to learn what's there as new people come in and old. So that all starts going together.
And then you're suggesting that the C community work is very hard work and could be lonely work within a single organization, and therefore the effect that I get of having a collaborative C community would actually leverage my ability as an organization to get the job done within my organization.
Very much. Besides having very large problems up here that you would like to share, you can just think of the investment here, that this is designed to be a prototype of an advanced Kodiak, and that probably is a very good candidate to have the most resources poured into it about your most advanced Kodiak. So you say, boy, I got a chance to have people move down there and live in that for a while, and I share the cost among these other organizations. Mm-hmm. And anyway, there's just many, many good things that start falling out if you think strategically about this, that's what would very soon be very valuable.
Well, the other thing that really excites me as a technologist about all of this is the possibility of the computer industry getting to the point in 2 years that otherwise it's probably going to take us 20 years to get to, in terms of evolving a level of standards for interoperability across systems that will really support human collaboration. And I can't, the way you're proposing to go about doing that really makes sense to me.
Right. Well, I'm not sure I have the same picture, the time constants you do. The 2 years is pretty short. But the thing is, once you really start joining forces to explore the frontier in a kind of a good way, that the orientation and the sense about what's there and what we need to do will start shaping up much, much better.
Well, that's the difference between you and me. I'm very impatient. I want to get it done in 2 years. And I certainly want to make sure that we take advantage of what you've invested 40 years to discover about what these architectural principles are and what these bootstrapping principles are.
I'd love to have it happen in 2 years. It's just...
How long do you think it will take, realistically, if we really get people going and excited about this concept and we pull together a C community work on this?
In 5 to 10 years, you could go a long way towards knowing what would be in an open hyperdoc and having lots of instances of organizations that are really moving in that direction. And we have to understand and be empathetic about the inertia and the cultural inertia that you have to deal with. And that a big challenge to the Cs is to find out better and better ways for B to start affecting their corporate culture, the attitudes people have, their perception of the change, their perception of their role in changing, etc. And that's slow but very, very important. And so anyway, I can't picture any other way but a cooperative bootstrapping, being able to climb that hill in any direct, reasonable way.
Great, thank you.
And thank you very much for your time, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.